A K-9 detected explosives in a car near a government building. His actions prevented a tragedy. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The morning was crisp and quiet, the kind of morning that suggested nothing unusual would happen. Officer Mark Stevens was on routine patrol with his K-9 partner, Axel, a highly trained Belgian Malinois. Axel had been with the force for 4 years and had an impeccable track record in detecting narcotics, explosives, and tracking down fugitives. As the two moved through the city streets in their cruiser, a call came over the radio, sharp and urgent. All units be advised. Suspicious vehicle reported near the federal building. Possible threat. Approach with caution. Mark's eyes met Axel's through the rearview mirror. Though the dog didn't understand the words, he sensed the shift in Mark's posture, the tightening of his grip on the wheel. The patrol car made a sharp turn, heading towards the location. As they arrived, a black sedan sat idling in a restricted parking zone, its windows darkly tinted. It was an ordinary car, one that wouldn't raise alarms on any other day. But something felt off. No one was inside, yet the engine remained running. Axel whined slightly, his ears pricking up as Mark put the car in park and stepped out cautiously. The air was thick with an unspoken tension. Mark radioed in his arrival, his hand hovering near his firearm as he approached the vehicle. Standard procedure dictated that K-9 units be deployed in cases like this, and Axel was already eager, his body alert and muscles taut. Mark gave a sharp command, and Axel leapt from the back seat, nose twitching as he approached the car. Axel circled the sedan, sniffing along the doors, the trunk, and finally beneath the vehicle. His behavior changed instantly. His tail stiffened, his ears locked forward, and he gave a short, sharp bark before sitting firmly in place. Mark's stomach tightened. That was Axel's alert signal. Whatever was in that car, it wasn't safe. Mark backed away, pressing the radio to his lips. Dispatch, this is Unit 27. K-9 alert on the vehicle. Possible explosive device. Request immediate bomb squad response. Within moments, additional officers arrived, their vehicles blocking off the streets, lights flashing like a warning to all who passed. Pedestrians were ushered away. Office workers inside the federal building were told to shelter in place, and the tension escalated. The bomb squad arrived swiftly, clad in heavy protective gear, their movements precise and methodical. Mark held onto Axel's leash tightly, his heart pounding as he watched them work. The bomb squad's lead technician carefully inspected the car, their scanner picking up something unusual beneath the frame. A crude yet effective device had been planted, the kind that could cause catastrophic damage if detonated. The technician signaled to his team, and the slow, delicate process of disarming began. Axel stood firm beside Mark, his body still vibrating with alertness. He had done his job, and now it was up to the specialists to prevent disaster. Minutes felt like hours as they worked, disarming wires, securing the package, ensuring that no secondary devices were lurking unseen. Finally, the lead technician turned and gave the all-clear signal. The bomb had been disarmed. A wave of relief washed over the officers, and Mark instinctively crouched beside Axel, running his fingers through the dog's fur. "Good boy," he murmured. "You just saved a lot of lives today." As the threat dissipated, detectives swarmed the area, piecing together the puzzle. Surveillance footage revealed a shadowy figure abandoning the car minutes before Mark and Axel arrived. The vehicle was traced back to a stolen registration, and now the hunt was on to find the perpetrator. News of Axel's heroic actions spread quickly. Reporters gathered outside the police station later that evening, eager to hear about the dog who had prevented a potential catastrophe. Mark, ever modest, simply said, "Axel did what he was trained to do. He's not just a dog, he's a hero." Axel, oblivious to the cameras and flashing lights, merely wagged his tail, content with the praise and extra treats he received that night. But the case wasn't over. Whoever had planted that bomb was still out there. And Mark knew that, with Axel by his side, they would stop at nothing to bring them to justice. Here is the next batch of the script. The investigation into the attempted bombing intensified overnight. Federal agents joined local law enforcement, combing through every piece of evidence left at the scene. The stolen car had been wiped clean of prints, and the device itself bore no distinct markings that could immediately trace it back to its maker. But Mark knew there was always something. One small detail that criminals overlooked, one thread that could unravel the entire operation. Axel sat beside him in the station, still alert despite the late hour. The bomb squad had safely transported the device to their lab, where forensic teams worked to uncover any usable leads. Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random act of violence. The federal building had been targeted for a reason. The question was, why now? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Captain Reynolds stepped inside, a file in hand. "We've got something," he said, placing it on the desk. Security footage from a nearby parking lot caught our suspect exiting the vehicle before disappearing into the crowd. Mark flipped the folder open. The still images weren't great, but they showed a hooded figure walking away briskly from the scene. "Facial recognition?" he asked. "Already running it through the system," Reynolds replied. "But there's something else." Witnesses reported seeing the suspect getting into a second vehicle 2 blocks away. "We pulled some footage of that car, stolen plates again. But there was a logo on the bumper, a faded one. Local repair shop." Mark's eyes sharpened. "That's our lead." Within an hour, they were on the move. Axel rode in the back seat as Mark and his partner, Detective Hayes, drove toward the auto shop in question. It was a small place, family-owned, but known for occasional shady dealings. They parked a block away, stepping out into the dim glow of the streetlights. Axel's ears twitched as he picked up the sounds of the city. Muffled voices from inside the shop, the distant hum of traffic. Mark clipped on Axel's lead. "Let's take a look." They approached quietly, keeping to the shadows. The garage was closed for the night, but a light flickered inside, illuminating movement. Mark signaled to Hayes, who nodded in understanding. They moved in tandem, checking the doors locked. But Axel's posture changed. His nose twitched, and he let out a low growl. "Something's inside," Mark murmured. Hayes reached for his radio, whispering into it. "We need backup at the location." Mark drew his firearm as he tested the side door. It gave way with a firm push. The air inside was thick with the scent of oil and metal, but there was something else too. A faint trace of sweat and adrenaline. Someone was here. Axel took the lead, his body low, moving with calculated precision. Mark trusted the dog's instincts implicitly. A sudden crash echoed through the shop. A figure bolted from the back room, sprinting toward the exit. "Stop! Police!" Mark shouted, breaking into a run. But before he could close the distance, Axel launched forward, his powerful legs propelling him across the space. The suspect barely had time to react before Axel tackled him, knocking him to the ground. The man struggled, but Axel held firm, his growl vibrating through the air. Mark was on him within seconds, securing the cuffs. "Nice try," Hayes muttered as they pulled the suspect to his feet. The man was breathing heavily, his eyes darting between them. "You got nothing on me," he spat. Mark smirked, glancing down at Axel, who still had his teeth bared just enough to remind the suspect of who had caught him. "Yeah, we'll see about that." As they searched the shop, they found what they needed: blueprints matching the bomb's design, receipts for chemicals, and a burner phone with messages that hinted at a larger plan. This wasn't just one man's job. There were more players in this game. But now they had a name, a lead, and Axel had once again proven that he was more than just a police dog. He was the key to bringing justice. Here is the next batch of the script. Back at the station, the interrogation room was filled with tension. The suspect, identified as Victor Lenz, had a long record of petty crimes, but nothing that indicated he was capable of orchestrating a bombing. He sat with his arms crossed, his eyes shifting between Mark and Hayes. His lips curled into a defiant smirk. "You got me for trespassing," he said, leaning back in his chair. "That's it. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time." Mark placed a folder on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were the photographs of the bomb components, blueprints, and the stolen vehicle used in the operation. "You think we don't know what you were doing in that garage?" Mark said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "You were preparing another attack, weren't you?" Lenz scoffed. "That's a stretch, Detective." Axel sat by Mark's side, his sharp eyes locked onto Lenz. The dog sensed the tension, his body still, yet his presence alone was enough to keep Lenz uneasy. Hayes leaned forward. "We know you're small time," he said. "You're not the brains behind this. But if you help us, maybe you walk away from this with something less than a life sentence." Lenz chuckled, shaking his head. "You think I'm afraid of prison? You got nothing on me." Mark exchanged a glance with Hayes before standing. "All right, maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe you were just in the wrong place. But see, here's the problem." He motioned to Axel. "This dog found you. And you know what that means? That means every piece of evidence we pull from that shop, every print, every fiber, leads straight to you." For the first time, Lenz hesitated. His smirk faltered just slightly. Mark continued, "And if you're covering for someone else, you'll be the one paying the price while they walk free." Silence settled in the room. Lenz exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. He shifted in his seat, as if debating something in his head. Axel let out a low, almost imperceptible growl. Finally, Lenz spoke. "All right," he muttered. "Maybe I know a guy." Hayes nodded. "Keep talking." Lenz hesitated, then leaned forward. "Name's Calloway. He's the one who set everything up." Mark felt a rush of adrenaline. That name wasn't just any name, it was one they had come across before, a known explosives expert who had managed to stay off the radar for years. If Lenz was telling the truth, they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had anticipated. "Where is he now?" Mark pressed. Lenz shook his head. "I don't know. He moves around. But he left something at the garage. Something important. He was supposed to pick it up tomorrow night." Mark and Hayes exchanged glances. This was it. The opening they needed. An operation was quickly put into motion. The garage was placed under surveillance, and a tactical team was put on standby. Axel, ever vigilant, was prepped for the mission. Mark could see the alertness in his partner's eyes. He knew something big was coming. As night fell, they waited in silence. The garage was dark, seemingly abandoned. But then, just past midnight, a black SUV pulled up. A man stepped out cautiously, looking around before heading toward the back entrance. Mark gripped his radio. Target confirmed. "Move in." Axel's muscles tensed as the team approached. They moved with precision, surrounding the garage. As the suspect reached for the door handle, the command was given. "Police! Hands in the air!" The suspect spun, but it was too late. Axel was already moving, closing the distance in seconds. The man tried to bolt, but Axel took him down with one swift tackle, pinning him to the ground. Mark rushed in, securing the cuffs. The suspect, Calloway, gritted his teeth, realizing his plan had fallen apart. "You should have known better," Mark said, nodding toward Axel. "We don't let guys like you slip through." The mission was a success. The explosives were confiscated, and the mastermind was finally in custody. Axel, once again, had proven himself to be the department's greatest asset. The investigation didn't end with Calloway's arrest. If anything, it had just begun. With him in custody, the department had a rare opportunity to dismantle an entire network of criminals involved in arms dealing and potential terrorism. Mark knew they had to move fast before others caught wind of the takedown and scattered. Calloway sat in the interrogation room, his wrists bound in cuffs, his expression unreadable. Unlike Lenz, this man exuded a quiet confidence, the kind that came with years of experience in evading the law. He had spent his life operating in the shadows, and he wasn't about to crack easily. Mark and Hayes entered the room, Axel following closely behind. Calloway's gaze flickered to the K9, then back to Mark. "Didn't think they'd send a dog to interrogate me," he muttered, leaning back in his chair. Mark smirked. "Axel's here because he's already done half the job," he said. "You would have been long gone if it weren't for him." Calloway shrugged. "Then maybe I should be worried." You should, Hayes said, placing a thick folder on the table. You're facing serious charges. Explosives possession, conspiracy, potential terrorism. But we're not here to talk about what we already know. We're here to find out what you're willing to give us. Calloway exhaled sharply, a subtle sign that he was calculating his options. And if I don't? He asked. Mark exchanged a glance with Hayes before flipping open the folder. Inside were images of the explosives they had recovered, Calloway's connections to past incidents, and most damning of all, a ledger they had found in the garage. It listed names, locations, and transactions that tied him to even bigger players. You talk, Mark said, his tone even. And maybe you see the outside of a prison cell before you're an old man. Calloway looked at the ledger, his eyes narrowing. For the first time, Mark saw the flicker of doubt in his expression. He knew he was in trouble. He just didn't know how deep. Axel, as if sensing the tension, let out a low growl. His ears perked forward. Calloway's jaw tightened. You trained him to do that? He asked. Mark shook his head. Nope. He just knows when someone's lying. Silence settled over the room. Calloway ran a hand through his hair, staring at the pages in front of him. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh. You guys really think you've got this all figured out, huh? We don't have to, Hayes said. We just need you to make a choice. Another pause. Then Calloway leaned forward. All right, he muttered. Maybe I have something you want. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. Then start talking. Over the next hour, Calloway unraveled a network larger than they had imagined. Names, locations, and connections that led to key figures in illegal arms trafficking and black market dealings. Some were local, but others extended far beyond state lines. As the information poured in, the weight of the case settled over Mark. This was bigger than they had anticipated. It wasn't just about a bomb near a government building. It was about preventing future ones. By the time Calloway finished, the department was already mobilizing to act on the intel. Multiple teams were being deployed for coordinated arrests, warrants were being issued, and federal agencies were stepping in. Axel, sitting patiently beside Mark, let out a contented sigh, as if knowing that his work had once again made the difference. Mark reached down, giving his partner a firm pat on the back. Another one down, he murmured. Hayes grinned. And probably a few more to go, but for now they had won. The moment Calloway started talking, the case took a drastic turn. What had initially seemed like an isolated attempt to plant explosives near a government building unraveled into something much larger. A vast underground network stretching across multiple states, involving arms dealers, smuggling rings, and even known international operatives. Mark and Hayes knew they had to act fast. Calloway had given them a starting point. A warehouse on the outskirts of town where shipments of weapons and illicit materials were processed before distribution. According to him, this location was more than just a storage facility. It was a hub where dangerous individuals gathered, where deals were made, and where the most sensitive operations took place. It was also heavily guarded. How many people are we talking about? Mark asked, leaning forward. Calloway hesitated, glancing between them and the K9 at their feet. Axel, sensing the man's discomfort, remained still but observant. At any given time, 10 to 15, Calloway finally admitted. But it's not just about numbers. These guys are well armed. Some of them have military backgrounds. If you go in unprepared, you won't make it out. Hayes exchanged a glance with Mark. This wasn't just a standard raid. It would require coordination, intelligence, and precise execution. That's why you're going to help us get inside, Hayes said. Calloway scoffed. And why the hell would I do that? Mark placed a photo in front of him, a surveillance image showing another high-level operative from the same network. Because if you don't, this guy walks free while you take the fall for everything. You want a chance to save your own skin? This is it. Calloway hesitated again, but the calculation was clear on his face. He had no loyalty to these people, only to his own survival. After a long pause, he exhaled sharply. Fine, he muttered. But you better not screw this up. The next night, the team assembled. SWAT units, undercover officers, and federal agents gathered in an abandoned lot near the warehouse. They went over Calloway's intel, memorizing the layout, entry points, and the timing of security rotations. Axel was outfitted with a tactical vest, his movements precise as he observed the pre-mission briefing. He wasn't just any K9. His instincts, training, and experience made him a critical asset in operations like these. "We breach from the north entrance," Hayes instructed. "There's an emergency exit here." He pointed to a side door, but it's likely locked from the inside. "We'll have secondary units covering that in case anyone tries to flee." Mark glanced at Calloway, who was standing under heavy guard. "If anything you told us is wrong," he warned, "this whole deal is off." Calloway held up his hands. "Look, I gave you everything I know. Just don't get yourselves killed." Mark didn't plan on it. The team moved out, approaching the warehouse with silent precision. Night vision optics gave them an advantage in the dimly lit perimeter, and Axel moved seamlessly alongside Mark, his ears twitching at every small sound. Then came the signal. Bang! A breaching charge detonated the north entrance, sending a shockwave through the air. The team moved in, weapons raised, clearing the first section of the warehouse. "Clear left. Clear right." Axel darted forward, his nose working overtime. He had been trained to detect more than just explosives. His acute senses picked up on adrenaline, fear, and movement in the darkness. Mark followed him closely as they advanced deeper into the facility. A sudden burst of gunfire erupted from the far side of the room. "Contact!" an officer yelled. The warehouse turned into a battlefield, with suspects firing from behind crates and metal structures. The team returned fire, using their training to move efficiently through the chaos. Axel's body stiffened as he focused on something to the right. He let out a sharp bark and lunged. "Go!" Mark commanded. Axel bolted toward a fleeing suspect, knocking him to the ground before he could reach a concealed weapon. The man struggled, but Axel's grip was ironclad. "Suspect down," Mark called, moving to secure him. Meanwhile, Hayes and the rest of the team pushed forward, systematically clearing the remaining sections of the warehouse. One by one, the criminals were subdued, forced to surrender under overwhelming tactical force. The operation lasted only 15 minutes, but in the high-stakes world of law enforcement, it felt like a lifetime. When the dust settled, every major player in the network had been captured. The warehouse was a goldmine of evidence: illegal weapons, financial records, encrypted communication devices. It was a complete takedown. Mark took a deep breath, looking down at Axel, who was panting but alert. "Another job well done, partner," he murmured, scratching behind the K9's ears. Hayes approached, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is bigger than we thought. We're looking at a massive syndicate. But tonight, we took down a damn good chunk of it." Mark nodded. "And we're just getting started." Axel sat proudly at his handler's side, his job complete, for now. As the night stretched on, the reality of their operation's success began to sink in. The criminals who had been captured were being processed, and the warehouse had been turned into an active crime scene, with forensic teams collecting evidence that would undoubtedly lead to more arrests. But for Mark, Hayes, and Axel, the night wasn't over yet. Inside one of the back rooms of the warehouse, a set of locked containers had been discovered. Containers that weren't on any of the records Calloway had provided. That was an immediate red flag. If even he didn't know about them, then they had been kept secret for a reason. "Let's get these open," Hayes ordered, motioning for one of the officers to bring over a set of bolt cutters. Mark glanced down at Axel, who was already sniffing at the edges of one of the crates. The dog let out a low, guttural growl, a sign that whatever was inside wasn't normal. "Wait," Mark said, stepping back. "Axel's picking up something." A bomb squad technician was called over immediately, his face tightening as he examined the crates. "We need to be careful. If these have been rigged, we don't want to set anything off." The room was cleared as a precaution, and the bomb squad used specialized equipment to scan the containers. What they found made everyone's blood run cold. "Explosives," the technician confirmed, his voice tight. "Not just any kind, either. These are military grade." Mark and Hayes exchanged a look. If these bombs had made it into circulation, They could have caused untold destruction. Who the hell were these guys working for? Hayes muttered, running a hand through his hair. Mark didn't have an answer, but he knew they had just uncovered something far bigger than they had initially thought. This wasn't just an arms smuggling operation, it was a terrorist network. As the bomb squad worked to neutralize the explosives, Axel remained on high alert. His ears twitched as he picked up movement outside, faint but distinct. Mark followed his partner's gaze, his instincts kicking in. "Something's not right," he murmured. Then the power cut out. In an instant, the warehouse was plunged into darkness. The chatter over the radios erupted with confusion. "We just lost power. Is this a setup? Everyone, stay sharp." Axel's body tensed, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. Mark pulled out his flashlight, scanning the area. Then, a flash of movement, shadows against the dim emergency lighting. "Contact!" someone yelled. Gunfire erupted, the sound ricocheting off the metal walls of the warehouse. They weren't alone. A second wave of armed operatives had arrived, likely trying to reclaim what was left of their operation before law enforcement could piece everything together. Hayes ducked behind cover as bullets struck the crates near him. "We need backup now." Mark and Axel moved as a unit, weaving through the chaos. The K-9's keen instincts allowed them to navigate the battlefield like no other, avoiding open spaces and tracking the unseen threats. Axel caught the scent of someone moving just beyond a stack of metal shelves. Without hesitation, he bolted forward. "Axel, get him," Mark commanded. The dog lunged, tackling a masked assailant to the ground. The man screamed, struggling, but Axel's bite was locked in place. "Suspect down," Mark called out, securing the target with handcuffs. More officers flooded the warehouse, engaging in a firefight with the intruders. But this time, the law had the advantage. With every passing second, more of the attackers were subdued. The few who remained quickly realized they were outmatched and attempted to flee. "Not on my watch," Hayes growled, taking off after one of them. Mark followed, Axel keeping pace at his side. They chased the fleeing suspect outside, where he tried to reach a waiting vehicle. "Stop!" Hayes barked. The suspect ignored him, scrambling to get inside the car. But Axel was faster. With an explosive burst of speed, the K-9 leaped forward, sinking his teeth into the man's arm before he could shut the car door. The suspect screamed, thrashing, but Axel held firm. Mark and Hayes closed the distance, dragging him out of the vehicle and forcing him to the ground. "It's over," Mark said breathlessly, restraining the last attacker. "You're done." The moment the suspect was cuffed, Axel let go, standing proudly as he panted from the exertion. Within minutes, the situation was finally under control. The surviving attackers were all in custody, the explosives had been secured, and the warehouse was officially locked down. As dawn approached, Mark finally took a breath. He looked down at Axel, who was still alert despite everything. "You really saved us tonight," Mark murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Didn't you, buddy?" Axel's tail wagged slightly, but his eyes never left the scene before him. Even after everything, he was still on duty. Hayes walked over, shaking his head in amazement. "That dog just saved an entire city," he said. "Again." Mark chuckled. "Yeah. And something tells me he's not done yet." As the dust settled on the scene, the scale of what they had just prevented started to sink in. The bomb squad continued to sweep the area, ensuring there were no additional threats hidden within the warehouse. The last thing they needed was an undetected explosive ready to go off when they least expected it. Mark stood beside Axel, watching as officers secured the suspects in separate transport vehicles, ensuring none of them could communicate with each other. Hayes walked over, rubbing a hand down his face. "The explosives are being transported to a secure location for further analysis. FBI's on their way. This just got a whole lot bigger than we thought." Mark exhaled slowly. "Yeah, no kidding. If Axel hadn't sniffed those out when he did..." Hayes didn't need him to finish the sentence. They both knew what could have happened. A high-profile government building was just a few miles away. If those explosives had been planted near it, the potential devastation would have been catastrophic. Axel, sensing the tension, let out a low whine. Mark knelt beside him, running a hand through his fur. "Good boy. You did good tonight." Before he could stand back up, Axel's ears perked, his gaze snapping to the side. Mark followed his line of sight. One of the detained men was staring at them, more specifically at Axel. His expression wasn't one of fear or anger, but something else. Something calculating. Mark straightened. "Hayes, something's off." Hayes followed his gaze. "What is it?" "That guy." Mark nodded toward the suspect. "He's not scared. He's not even upset he got caught. He's watching us." "Watching Axel." Hayes frowned. "You think he knows something?" Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a few steps forward, his eyes locked onto the suspect. The man smirked. "Nice dog," he said, voice low but carrying just enough venom to make Mark's skin crawl. Mark's jaw tightened. "You got something you want to say?" The man leaned back against the patrol car, as if he were lounging in his own living room. "You think this is over?" He chuckled. "You think catching a few of us means you stopped anything?" Mark exchanged a glance with Hayes. "You want to elaborate on that?" The man shrugged. "Would it matter if I did? You already know, don't you? This wasn't about a few weapons or some quick cash. This was about something much bigger." Axel let out a growl, his body rigid beside Mark. Hayes folded his arms. "If you want to make a deal, now's the time to do it. Might be the only chance you get." The man just smiled. "You'll see soon enough." That was all he said before he shut his mouth, his expression giving nothing away. Mark clenched his fists. He wanted to push further, to get something more, but he knew pressing too hard wouldn't get them anywhere. He stepped back, exhaling slowly. "This isn't over," Hayes muttered. Mark nodded. Not by a long shot. By the time the sun had fully risen, the warehouse was no longer the chaotic battleground it had been hours earlier. Officers were wrapping up their reports, the evidence team was collecting the last of the materials, and the suspects were being transported to secure facilities. Mark sat on the back bumper of a patrol car, running a hand over his face. Axel sat beside him, ever vigilant, his gaze scanning their surroundings. "You look like hell," Hayes commented as he walked over, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He handed one to Mark. Mark accepted it with a grunt. "Feel like it too." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the night still pressing down on them. "FBI's gonna take over the case," Hayes finally said. "They're saying this could be connected to something much bigger than we thought." Mark wasn't surprised. "Yeah, I figured." Axel shifted beside him, resting his head against Mark's knee. "Axel saved a lot of lives tonight," Hayes murmured. "Not just ours. The whole damn city." Mark glanced down at his partner. "Yeah, he did." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. It was the silence of 2 men who had been through hell and come out the other side. Finally, Mark stood, stretching out his sore muscles. "Come on, buddy. Let's get you home." Axel wagged his tail, standing as well, ever ready to follow his handler. As they walked toward the car, Hayes called after them. "You think he knows what he did tonight? How many people he saved?" Mark glanced at Axel, then smiled. "Yeah, I think he does." And with that, they drove off, leaving behind the chaos of the night, knowing full well that when the next threat came, they'd be ready. Because heroes like Axel never truly rest. The drive back to the precinct was quiet, the early morning sun casting long shadows over the empty streets. Mark kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on Axel's head as the K9 lay stretched out in the passenger seat. He was exhausted, his body finally beginning to feel the weight of the night's events, but his mind was still spinning. The suspect's words lingered in his head. "You think catching a few of us means you stopped anything?" The way he had said it, so smug, so certain, it didn't sit right. Mark had been in the force long enough to know when someone was bluffing and when they were telling the truth. And this guy, he wasn't bluffing. They pulled into the precinct parking lot, and Mark let out a long sigh. "Come on, buddy," he said, giving Axel a pat. "Let's get inside." Axel perked up at the sound of his handler's voice, stretching before jumping out of the car. His movements were slower than usual, his exhaustion evident, but there was still an alertness in his gaze. Always watching, always ready. Inside, the station was buzzing with activity. Officers who had been off duty the night before were being briefed on what had happened. Detectives were already analyzing the evidence, and the air was thick with caffeine and tension. "Mark," Hayes called from across the room. He was holding a folder, his expression grim. Mark felt his stomach tighten. "What is it?" Hayes handed him the folder. "We ran deeper checks on the guys we arrested last night, and we found something." Mark flipped it open, scanning the documents. It didn't take long for his heart to start pounding. "You've got to be kidding me." "They were communicating with someone outside the city," Hayes said. "Encrypted messages. Took our tech guys hours just to scratch the surface." Mark shook his head. "So they weren't just a small group running an operation. They were part of something bigger." Hayes nodded. "And get this, one of the messages we decrypted? It mentioned Phase 2. A cold chill ran down Mark's spine. "Phase 2? Yeah. And whatever it is, it's happening soon." Mark clenched his jaw. "This isn't over. Not even close." Axel sat patiently beside Mark's desk as officers scrambled to make sense of the new information. Reports were flying in, leads were being followed, and tension filled the room. The FBI was now fully involved, their agents combing through everything they had found at the warehouse. But there was still so much unknown. Hayes sat down across from Mark, rubbing a hand over his face. "We need a break, man. Something. Anything." Mark was about to respond when Axel suddenly sat up, ears twitching. His nose flared, and he let out a low, warning growl. Mark stiffened. "What is it, boy?" Axel's gaze locked onto the entrance of the station. Seconds later, the doors swung open, and two men in suits walked in. They carried themselves with the kind of authority that made it clear they weren't here for small talk. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, scanned the room before his gaze settled on Mark and Axel. He approached, flashing a badge. "Detective Mark Dawson?" he asked. Mark nodded. "Yeah, Special Agent Carter, FBI." The man gestured to his partner. "This is Agent Reynolds. We need to speak with you. Now." Mark exchanged a glance with Hayes before standing. "What's this about?" Carter's expression was unreadable. "The case you just cracked open is bigger than you know, and we're going to need your K9. Mark blinked. "Axel?" Carter nodded. "We've been tracking this group for months, but your team uncovered something we hadn't anticipated. Axel's nose is the reason we found those explosives before they could be used. And now we need him for what comes next." Mark felt a mix of pride and unease. "And what exactly is next?" Carter's jaw tightened. "A location. One we believe holds the answers we've been looking for. But it's rigged with traps, and we need the best bomb-sniffing dog we have." Mark looked down at Axel. The dog sat poised and ready, as if he understood everything that was being said. Hayes let out a breath. "Well, damn." Mark squared his shoulders. "All right, where are we going?" Carter's gaze was serious. "Somewhere only your dog can lead us." Minutes later, Mark and Axel were in an unmarked black SUV, speeding toward the outskirts of the city. The FBI had received intel on a possible secondary warehouse, a location that had been mentioned in the decrypted messages. If the first one had been a staging area, this one could be even more dangerous. Axel sat alert in the back seat, his ears perked, his body tense. He could sense the urgency in the air. "We have reason to believe this warehouse isn't just another storage unit," Carter explained. "It might be their command center." Mark frowned. "You mean the people running this whole operation might be there?" Carter nodded. "If we're lucky." Mark shook his head. "I don't like this. If they know we're onto them, they might accelerate whatever they're planning." Reynolds finished. The SUV pulled up a block away from the suspected location. It was an old, abandoned factory, the kind that had been left to rot for decades. From the outside, it looked empty, but Mark had been doing this long enough to know that meant nothing. Carter turned to Mark. "We go in silent. Axel leads." Mark took a steadying breath, then turned to his partner. "All right, boy, let's do this." Axel let out a soft woof in response, his tail flicking with determination. As they approached the factory, the tension in the air was thick. Axel sniffed the ground, his nose working overtime. And then he froze. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Mark's pulse spiked. "He's on to something." Carter signaled for the team to halt. "What is it?" Axel took slow, deliberate steps forward, his body low to the ground. Mark followed his lead, trusting his partner's instincts. And then Axel stopped. Mark's eyes darted to where his K9's nose was pointing. A barely visible wire stretched across the entrance. His stomach dropped. "Tripwire," Carter cursed under his breath. "They knew we'd come." Mark crouched down, examining the setup. If Axel hadn't detected it, they would have walked straight into a trap. "How bad?" Hayes asked through the radio. Mark exhaled. "Bad enough. We need a new way in." Carter glanced around. "There's a side entrance, but if they've trapped the front, there's no telling what else they have waiting." Mark looked at Axel. "You got one more in you, buddy?" Axel's eyes were sharp, determined. Mark stood. "All right, let's finish this." As they moved toward the alternate entrance, Axel leading the way, Mark knew one thing for sure. Whatever they were about to walk into, his K9 partner had just saved them all. Again.